Okay, we're going to jump right into a quantitative study. This is the table from your book, so it goes through all these columns, and we're going to go through them with an article that I've chosen just randomly from, sorry about that, from somebody's table. Okay, so the name of this article is right here. Here's our three authors, and this is the Journal of Community Health, and it was in 2015. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut and paste that information right into this first title. Here's our three authors, year, here's the journal, and then this is the title of the article. So the next thing we're going to look at is conceptual framework and theoretical basis for the table. Well, actually, I'm looking for all these things as I read through this article. So let me back up here. What I, of course, always do, what we do is start with the abstract. It gives us a lot of information, but it doesn't give us the full, or the entire story. So we really do need to read the entire article. So we're talking about school-based interventions here right off the bat. And this is telling us about following an obesity intervention implemented by a low-income school district, they found evidence of weight status change. So right there I know what they did. They did an intervention program in a low-income school. Their target population was 4,000 students in these grades 3 through 12. But in the end, if we cruise down here and we're reading, I notice their sample size is N equals 2,259. So something I want to keep an eye on is, why didn't they do all 4,000? Okay. Also here this talks about data analysis, and it talks about a longitudinal descriptive inferential study, which I know right off the bat is quantitative, and if I didn't, inferential is that, and if I didn't know that, I would go on to, paired sample t-test and chi-square test. Well, that's numbers, so that's quantitative. And as we read further through the abstract, we will notice I have some p-values here. So again, that is a quantitative study. So the introduction always gives us a great backdrop for the study. It tells us about school-based interventions. It tells us how long this longitudinal study went on, from 2007 to 2010. And also as we scroll through, there's a lot of good information, and I'm doing this quickly. I will send you the article so you can actually see and compare it to the table as well. But it talks a little bit more about what they did in depth. The other thing it speaks to is the IRB approval from the appropriate spot. Whenever you see IRB approval, you'll know right off the bat it's going to be a research study versus a quality improvement project. And I'll explain that in an email what that means, because just for lack of time. QI improvement or QI projects don't need IRB. They always run it through their entity, but in the end they really don't need it. It's research that needs it. I like this last sentence because it tells us specifically what this article is about. It presents the results of a longitudinal analysis among those who have at least baseline and endpoint height and weight measurements, and 2,259. That tells me right here why they didn't use all 4,000 students. They only used the 2,000 and some because these people had the endpoint, the baseline and the endpoint data. Okay, so let's skip to methods here. This is nice the way it lays it out. Design. So it tells us this is a 3-year longitudinal cohort study. So what you're going to write is this is a quantitative 3-year longitudinal cohort study. And this is what they looked at: weight, height, body mass index, and BMI percentile in grades in children in grades 3 through 12. They did get their approval. Okay, the sample, it tells us again what it was, 3 through 12. The N, 2,259, and then it gives us some characteristics of the sample population. The 39% grades 3 through 5, 38 middle schoolers, and so forth. Okay, so let me go to the table now because we want to address some things. One thing I noted as I went through the article, there was no conceptual framework or theoretical basis for the study. So I'm going to write that. You'll see I wrote it down right here. Most truthfully, research studies should address this. They use one. Typically, studies use one. You utilize a framework to keep you in line here. But it should always be mentioned. So they didn't, so I wrote that. Design and method. So I already mentioned the design was a quantitative three-year longitudinal cohort from fall of 2007 to the spring of 2010, and that is the spring and fall are actually mentioned in the article somewhere. That's where I pulled it over. So the study type, okay, that tells us what we did and what was done in the study. So in a nutshell, what happened is these guys examined height, weight, BMI, and BMI percentile. I just didn't write that in there. Post-school based obesity intervention program in a low-income school. So the intervention program, if we would have read through looked at it much more closely, it was an extensive physical education program that involved equipment and curricula, among a few other things. Okay, the sample and the setting. We know we had 4,000 target students, and we ended up with this sample, N, and we know, and I write in here, why didn't they use all 4,000? It was because these people had the endpoint, height and weight, the baseline and the endpoint. Okay, it was a purposive sample, meaning they selected who they needed, which is fine. And the setting was a low-income school in New York. Here's the characteristics I talked about, specifically the population. You don't have to do this, but I talked about male and female. But one thing I did write was I noticed it was 89% non-Hispanic white. So it's like, well, that could be biased. Did they just take these white kids and compare it and leave everybody else out? But what they really did is they did write in the article is this represents the population in the school. So therefore, it is what it is. There's no biases. That's the population, and that's it. Okay, major variables and their definitions. And we want to look at independent variables and dependent variables. Just do the best you can. And again, if you guys have questions, you can always shoot them over. But we know the independent variable was the education program. That was the intervention. The definition, as I just explained, kind of what that it was, looked at curriculum and all those that type of thing. And our outcome variables were weight and BMI. So the reason I know that is because this education program is the intervention, or it's the variable we're going to manipulate to see if it has an outcome on weight and BMI. Okay? Height is mentioned in there, and the reason height's there, remember, we do look at height as they grow as well, but it also is necessary for the calculation of the BMI. Okay, so the measurement of the major variables. So we know that these are our variables, and what we really want to look at is not so much the program, the independent variable here, but is the height and the weight. And in the article it talked about how they were measured, a stadiometer to the nearest 1/4 inch for height, I don't know if that's how you pronounce that, and then a calibrated digital scale to the nearest 1/10 of a pound for weight. I don't need to address the author. I don't know who invented height and weight, and that was years ago, those scales. And reliability, we don't need to mention it of these scales either, because these have been around. These are a given, this height and weight. So let me go back to this. And the reason I knew this, because there's a thing about height and weight, is there's a little section called measures, and it talks about how the height, right here, the stadiometer, and then the digital scale. So I just pulled that data over. Okay, so analysis and results. So they used a program called SPSS, and I pulled that over into the category, into the column, which I will show you. It tells you how they analyzed weight, and let's see, right here it says they used a paired samples t-test for a BMI percentile, and from the fall, spring, from fall 2007 to spring, the results. So here I know that they use paired t-tests, and I knew that from the sample, or from the abstract as well. And then if I scoot down further, I see this paired samples t-test and a chi-squared test. Good. Okay. So I'm going to go right over here. All this column cares about is what statistics were used in the data analysis. So we used SPSS, we used paired samples t-test, and we used chi-squared test. It's really important to mention the main statistics. Some articles will go on and on about statistics. Don't bother with descriptive statistics, meaning percentages and things like that, unless you feel the need to put that in there, and unless that's pretty much all the quantitative study was about, was percentiles. But this really specifically brought out paired t-test and chi-squared, okay? So the next thing we really want to look at is the study findings. So if I go back to the article, right here, I'm going to see that the paired samples t-test showed a statistically significant decrease in the BMI percentile, which was a P of 0.001. Okay, two things here I want to bring to light. When we're talking about statistics, you need to use the word statistically significant, because there's two types of significance. One is statistical and the other is clinical, and you're actually going to be talking about both. But it's proper to use statistically significant when we're talking about these numbers. And then you had a p-value of less than 0.001. In APA format, do not put a 0 in front of the decimal. It's not acceptable. So, and I'm surprised they even did it here, even though it's not APA format. Okay, so that gives us the results of that. And then it talks about the chi-squared test for weight over the 3 years. And it shows that it's statistically decreased. And it gives us these results with a p-value of 0.001. You can write those results in there if you want. What I did is I just wrote that it showed an improvement that was, in weight status post the intervention and BMI. You don't even need to write that. But the paired t-test showed statistically significant decrease in BMI, and I think that was percentile, from baseline post-intervention, and the p-value is 0.001. That's all I really cared about, was the statistical significance. You can write the rest in there if you want, but if I need to go back and look at the article, I know it was statistically significant. The other thing, the chi-squared showed that it was statistically significant decrease in weight, also with a p of 0.001. The thing I want to bring out that's really important, this column, the study findings, ties right back, it is directly related to this column, the major variables. So what you need to talk about is the findings related to your variable, okay? So we know this is all about the post-education intervention, or our independent variable, the education program. And what I want to talk about is what we got with the dependent variable of BMI, so I mentioned it here, and the dependent variable of the weight, so I mentioned it here. Okay? So, again, this finding, this column, study findings, needs to tie back directly to the major variables. You're reporting your findings on these variables. Okay, last but not least, this is the appraisal. This is your clinical significance. 2 worth of practice, strength, and evidence of the study, limitations, risk or harm if there was any. They did get IRB approval. I didn't really notice any risk or harm in this study. Feasibility for practice, level of evidence. So if we go back to the article really quickly, you will read through the results, but you'll also read through the discussion. You'll find, if you ever write a research article, you'll find that the discussion is often the hardest thing to write. You're really pulling things together. What I wrote and what I looked at here was the limitations, and I highlighted them, and then truly the clinical significance of this study. So I pulled it right back over to this table, and what was brought out in the article is, first of all, a problem with this, or a limitation with this article, was that they weren't able to measure which specific aspect of the intervention really made the difference. So we know there was a difference made in BMI and weight, but what really did it? Was the curricula? Was it the curricula? Was it the certain equipment they put into play? And that's okay. This is a limitation, and they mentioned it, and that's what's important. Another important thing was they didn't have a control group. And that's okay as well. They just mentioned it. So it's important that they just mentioned it. They did have IRB approval. The clinical significance I talked about, the study suggests that consistent school-based interventions can be beneficial, and I think that's really important. And I think it's also a good study, and it was feasible to consider the entire education plan, or at least parts of education if I really wanted to do this at school age. Kids. The most important thing, not the most important, we need to do the level of evidence as well. And remember, I talked about this. So it was an AACN level 3, and if I use the other, it was a level C. And you can go back and look at that. Okay, we're going to move on to